Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and today I'm joined by Mr. Michael Morris. Michael, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you, and very glad to be getting underway to please Morris. I see he's getting a bit impatient there to see us. Very nice to see you too, Morris, and all the other guests.
Indeed. And of course, Makone Maja. Makone, you had your laptop stolen recently, which is why you disappeared for a little while. Are you back and running, and how are things?
Good to be back, and hello to everybody, excluding Marius.
Very good. All right, let's get started. And I think we're going to start off with some comments made by ANC Secretary General Fikile Mbalula, who continues to hold a special place in my heart as being one of the most amusing characters in South African politics. And he's kind of done it again. He was giving an interview on JJ Tabane's Power to Truth show, and he said, the ANC is on top of the power crisis. He says, from what I know, from where I'm seated, from the work that's being done by government and ministers and so on, the load shedding before the end of the year should be something of the past. I can assure you that load shedding will be reversed and it will be dealt with decisively. So he seems to be kind of suggesting that we're just on the edge of load shedding being cured. Well, at the same time, in what seems to be a little bit strange sequence of events, Pravin Gordhan was going to China to negotiate the end of an impasse regarding some locomotives for Transnet. However, without telling anyone, he also seems to have taken along some of the senior management of Eskom, including its interim CEO, Caleb Kasim. And while they were in China, they say that they had interacted with various entities and that some of these Chinese entities had offered to assist with our power crisis. Gordhan said there was an offer of assistance to address the current environment that we find ourselves in from various entities in China. I'm not qualified to assess what is needed or what is being offered, which is why the acting CEO and two others from Eskom were there to interact with the various entities and establish for themselves what could be done. He also went on to say that he couldn't give us specific details about what was talked about due to, quote, sensitivities involved in such processes. He also, during the same thing, promised that the unbundling of Eskom, which was promised by government a while ago and appears to have just stalled for unknown reasons, is that there will be a lot of progress on this before the end of the year, and that they had begun running modeling simulations to see how the new generating part or the distribution part of Eskom would be able to make money once it was separated from the generating part. They also said that he also said they've had 2 or 3 interactions with the State Grid Corporation of China, which is the world's largest transmission company, to look at the way that they run their show. Makone, firstly, what do you make of what Fikile Mbalula says about how, government's basically on top of this and it should be solved pretty quickly? And secondly, about getting outside help. Gordhan did say that there were countries other than China that had offered to help, but was very vague on the details. What do you make of all this?
Just on Fikile Mbalula's comments, I like how there's sort of a general consensus in the country about how seriously we should take him as a former minister or even Secretary General of the ANC, and that's not seriously at all. I also can't think of a better position for him than Secretary General of the ANC. He's a great hype man, but at the end, I think all this is wishful thinking. And he follows a line of similar comments made by Minister Gwede Mantashe. I believe Enoch Godongwana has made or given crazy or similarly implausible timelines about how soon the load shedding crisis would be over. Because of course, if it was that quick and that easy to fix, it would have already been done so many years ago and way before there was crisis.
Right, he's getting flack for saying this, but actually Enoch Godongwana, the finance minister, said something similar at, I think it was Davos at the beginning of the year.
Exactly. And nobody flinched when it's the Minister of Finance, but because again of that general consensus about the razzmatazz, we all chuckle and giggle and ignore, as we should. But I think on the trip to China, it's reminiscent of the nuclear deal, where they approached Russia and China to procure nuclear for South Africa. But I'm not persuaded that the solution to load shedding in South Africa exists outside of the four corners of the borders of this country. I think the moment we deal with the operational challenges that are happening at Eskom, then can we really get to the bottom of the generation of electricity and the supply of electricity. But I don't see how the solution lies outside of the country. And I sort of get a feeling that this is how the ANC operates. They push the country into a corner of sort of despair and desperation, and then force a solution on us once we are cornered, because then there's no time to sort of do your due diligence or cross your T's and dot your I's. And so you are forced into a position. And I feel like we're slowly being led into that direction.
So, when it comes to doing business with China, I'm always quite skeptical. And I will just say that is my view, and I believe a view confirmed by the evidence, that there's no such thing really as an independent business entity in China. When you do business with a large corporation in China, you are doing business effectively with the Communist Chinese Party, which holds indirect control basically over the whole Chinese economy. And so China is very important for the world for a large number of reasons, and particularly when it comes to infrastructure. They really are in the infrastructure game right now. They've been rolling out an enormous amount of it. But I don't know. I feel like one should be cautious about help from the People's Republic of China, in that if you're not careful, it will come with strings attached, which may not necessarily be to your long-term benefit. However, when you have a crisis as severe as load shedding, I wonder how much of a choice one really has. Michael, what do you make of this?
I absolutely agree with you. But I think Makone also made a very important point in setting this out, that we've got this feeling that we're being pushed into a situation where there won't actually be choices. There won't actually be an opportunity to sit down and contemplate, should we do this, should we do that? It'll simply be presented to us as a fait accompli. And this is really the risk with China. And maybe China is actually perceiving exactly the same circumstance and calculating, our moment will come. All we need to do is just, hold back until it's unavoidable, and we'll then step in with the solution, which will, incorporate South African interests into ours. Who knows? I mean, but I absolutely agree with you, with both of you. But certainly with the risk with China, I think caution is called for. It's not a free and open society. It has all sorts of geopolitical anxieties and interests that don't mesh with ours. So I think caution is certainly called for. And I also, the other point that I think Makone makes is vital, is that the solution is actually here, and what it takes is political courage and sound kind of a policy approach, sound planning. The solution is actually here. We all know it's here. It just takes a bit of courage and decisiveness on the part of the government, and that's essentially what it's not willing to do. What we have, the sort of wording that you see in Fikile Mbalula's comment, I can assure you, we've had these kind of assurances so often before, and will be dealt with decisively. It's always something that's going to happen. It's not something that they can announce today. Today we are doing X, Y, and Z. This is something that's going to happen end of the year, next 5 years, next 6 months, and so we keep being pulled along until, as Makone says, you're suddenly confronted with a crisis that removes all options except the single one that is now pressed upon us. So that's.
I also just have the sort of personal bugbear with this, and this is a thing you see from government all the time, where it hides behind either a technicality or it says a legal process, something like that, and refuses to give details about something. Pravin Gordhan in Parliament doesn't have to say specifically which companies he talked to and this and this and this, but a little bit more detail than offer of assistance to address the current environment, can't talk about it due to sensitivities involved with such processes. What does that mean? Why? Why are we being kept in the darkness? It does always. I think at this stage, it's not always necessarily malevolent as an attempt to hide something, although it often is. I think a lot of it is now just sort of so ingrained in the culture of government that the public will know when we tell them that they can know.
I think there's another thing that complements both what you, Nick, have said and Michael. On Nick's part, it's this level of mystery when they are communicating issues of Eskom and whatever solution is supposed to come out of that. But also on Michael's side, not being left with any options, but the one they've chosen for us, it's a state of emergency, right? Which they've shown us they're able to declare at the drop of a hat and revoke equally at the drop of a hat without showing whether there was any reason for such a state of emergency. So I think they are mapping out their steps and we're being led and following along. But yeah, I suspect we're being led to the slaughter here.
Well, let's hope not. Just talking briefly. Go ahead, Mike.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, I sometimes think to myself, the one phrase that I don't hear myself saying enough is, I don't know. But this is really a classic instance of where we don't know because we're not being told. And a great deal of speculation and the pessimism and all sorts of stuff that one encounters in society could actually be quietly addressed, quietly removed if we had an environment in which there was this accountability. There was a sense that, if you stand up in Parliament, you say something, you are at least going to explain yourself in a little more detail, sufficient to allow people to make up their own minds and not, speculate wildly about whether we selling the country off to the Chinese or whether, we're going to be suddenly presented with a crisis plan that is already there. And it all arises from this condition which you described so rightly as this sort of ingrained culture, and it's a kind of a non-accountability culture really, which is a problem. Yeah,
I play devil's advocate when I say it, but Michael, we're too desperate, we're too far along, everything's falling apart. We can't afford accountability. Sure. Transparency, where we can't afford to hold our noses up and not work with China or whoever else is being lined up for
you know what that excuse is like, Makone. It's a little bit like you've left your homework to the last minute and then you tell your mom you can't unpack the dishwasher. No, I have to do this right now.
That's eventually, right? There's no time for due process. Things are falling apart. We're at stage 8, guys.
So on the other side, there was an interesting little article in News 24 today, just about some of the practicalities of what winter can do to you if you are living off of solar power. And it was quite interesting. It basically said that while in Gauteng, solar power is pretty much unaffected because what you lose in the shorter daylight hours and in the different angle of the sun, you kind of gain in the fact that there tends to be less cloud, although apparently the weather didn't get that memo because there's been a strange amount of rain. But anyway, but that in the Western Cape, right when you would be wanting quite a lot of electricity, one supposes, for the dark and the cold, the output of solar power can drop by like 50% in winter, which is not great. And I think some of this shows kind of the limitations of the fact that the only way for a lot of people to kind of get off the grid is through a technology like solar. Obviously, it's great in a lot of ways, but it does have drawbacks. And this is, once again, we're kind of, even people who are escaping the state are sort of forced into a path that isn't optimal, I think. Michael, do you have any thoughts on this before we move on?
Ironically, today is quite sunny here, and I understand it's overcast there, but it's so true. When winter comes, I think the reduction in sunshine is a huge disincentive to spending a large amount of money that's required for putting in solar electricity, and that's one of my big problems with it. It's fine for rich people, I think, but for ordinary folk like ourselves and people living in townships and informal settlements, it's just not a solution. We shouldn't. We can talk about that as a nice to have, but the main thing we want to must insist on is decent, affordable, accessible electricity. That is what we want, and it's great to have all these other things, but they're not a replacement.
Exactly, and that doesn't mean that you have to have some huge state entity that works well to provide it. You can have broken up, decentralized systems, small companies, and in some countries they have multiple power companies that compete for your business. There's lots of models you can follow, but having to do your own electricity yourself to be some sort of self-sufficient fortress is ultimately not the way to go.
No.
Okay, let's move on to our next story, and this is kind of related, but also kind of not. This was comments made by Mining and Energy Minister Makone Maja at a conference recently, where he complained about the role of environmentalists in blocking development. He said that court challenges will not deter government from pursuing oil and gas in the country. He said, quote, "We are battling with the exploration of gas and oil. We stay in court. It is one process we are prepared to engage in. We are going to endure. People can take us to court as many times as they can. We will continue with gas and petroleum exploration. In South Africa, we have done something very painful. We have given environmentalists a veto over development." And there are various projects that government is looking to be involved in. It wants to do a gas to power plant in Richards Bay. It's also got the car power ships, which are these big Turkish power ships to provide energy off the coast. But further than that, there's increasing speculation and increasing evidence that South Africa may be sitting on an enormous amount of oil and gas, some of it under the Karoo, some of it off the coast, some of it perhaps in the kind of former Transvaal area. And I guess, Michael, let me just start with you. What do you make of the minister's comments here? He's kind of laying the blame at environmentalists, but I don't think that's the full story of why we haven't developed an oil and gas industry.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we were chatting earlier before the show and sort of flighting the thought that he's kind of got a point in a way, in the sense that there is perhaps an undue emphasis on among environmentalists or that whole sort of lobby in shutting down industries that in fact contribute most to, or potentially could contribute most to, transforming the society economically and socio-economically, and in fact in so doing reduce the environmental impact of the way we live. But that's a more complex debate. Or the kind of longer term one, but the more pointed question is is who is ready to blame for the difficulty of exploiting these resources that we have, that could in fact both make life better for most people in the country and indeed improve our sort of ecological circumstances. And your father, in fact, James Lorimer, as listeners may not know, is an MP, and he's the shadow minister of, let me get this right, the DA's shadow minister of mineral resources. So he really is plugged into this issue. He's written a few pieces recently pointing this out, that one of the key impediments to development and to exploiting the resources that we have and exploiting them in an environmentally sensitive way is exactly government legislation that simply makes it difficult, makes it very hard for prospectors and mining companies to see a viable project which they could take on in such a way that would be good for the people of South Africa and good for the environment at the same time. So it's a kind of misguided attack, I think, in a way, on Maja's part.
I must say, this is, I've said before that I've been tempted from time to time to defend things Maja says, and I'm a little bit tempted here. I do think also that government often, what's kind of outrageous is that there are plenty of illegal projects around the country, particularly kinds of like illegal mining and sort of cowboy type operations where the rules aren't even vaguely followed at all. So I think it's always a little bit silly that these like larger companies which tend to follow the rules because they can get in trouble with foreign governments if they spill all the oil into the sea or poison all the children or whatever. A lot of the time is focused on those corporations, which are far less likely to mess up. And in the meantime, we've got all this illegal nonsense going on where people are being poisoned and the land is being destroyed, and government's just not able to police that. So anyway, but Makone, what do you make of the story? What do you make of what the minister here is saying?
Yeah, so I think he's partially right. I would just add to his statement. He says, we've given environmentalists a veto over development. I would add government. We have also given government that ability to serve as this huge, gigantic obstacle to development in the country through constant bureaucracy, red tape. I mean, ease of doing business in this country is actually really pathetic, especially in the mining industry. But to credit to the minister, I myself watched an interview a while ago over the I think gas reserves in the Karoo, and there was an environmentalist on the show who was talking openly about all the extent to which he will go to weaponize the judiciary to make sure that the exploration of that gas and the drilling never happens, that he will wind up the municipality in case after case after case to make sure that it never happens. So it's no secret. They speak openly about how far they are willing to go. But similarly, is the government, if not even more to blame than environmentalists, to blame for the lack of development in the country?
Right. I mean, you just take a look at our mining industry that already exists and how it's been shrinking. I think last week or this week, Anglo Gold, in what was a long expected move, took its listing off of the JSE and is now off to New York, basically. And we've seen the number of new prospecting things in the country go down. We're really not in a great place when it comes to mining, and it's precisely because of this hostility to business, because the labor relations are so bad, because the unions are so toxic, because the BE requirements are too onerous. Foreign investors are not going to give away a third of their company just for the privilege of mining here. I will say that the last thing on this is that while I think a developing country like ours should take seriously oil and gas as a way to kind of uplift themselves economically, despite some of the environmental problems they cause, I do also fear a little bit that one can become like a country like Equatorial Guinea or Nigeria or Saudi Arabia, where the oil industry allows the government to sort of entirely give up on the rest of the economy because it's just making so much government revenue from that, which is not a good place to be either. Michael, do you have any final thoughts on this before we move on?
I mean, I think your last warning is a valid one, and I said also, I mean, speaking for my own part, I'm all for a measure of environmental protection, or at least consciousness about what human activity does to the environment, and monitoring and vigilance and so on. But I think the point, and it comes back to various things that Makone has said also, that the economic dynamism, which it is in fact probably the best security against degradation of the environment and degradation of people, actually, their rights and opportunities, is threatened both by the dogged and perhaps damaging kind of environmental activism, as well as by the legislation that makes it difficult for companies to make a going concern of these things, and which we use all the time. Environmentalists also use their cell phones, they use the internet and so on. It all comes from the wealth and the resources and so on that is delivered by the private sector and by mining industry and the industry generally. So we're all part of this, and it's a question of finding a practicable, sensible way to go forward, which I think would also likely reduce the risk that you've just referred to, Nicholas, also in this resource reliance and the penalty that comes with that.
Indeed. All right, let's quickly move on to our last story for today, and this is a couple of days old, but I think it's still worth discussing. A group called the Socioeconomic Rights Institute, who famously took Herman Mashaba to court for some of his actions regarding hijacked buildings and illegally occupied properties in the city centre of Johannesburg, attacked the city of Johannesburg's transport MMC and briefly acting Mayor Makone for what they claimed are unlawful raids, conducting searches, and threatening to evict residents, as well as demolishing a building without proper court authorization. Makone was made the acting mayor over the weekend, and immediately proceeded to go on a sort of media blitz where he was running around to hijack buildings, and he went to a legally occupied building in Windsor East in Johannesburg and had it demolished. I saw someone claiming that the building wasn't checked properly for people. I don't know if that's true, but anyway, so there's this group, the socioeconomic rights group, says, at a time when the city is grappling with numerous challenges, it is disconcerting the primary focus of the acting mayor was to subject vulnerable communities to unconstitutional conduct that violates their fundamental rights to dignity and privacy. They referenced a court case that they won against Makone Maja, where, according to them, the court held that these raids were conducted for an ulterior purpose, which was the abuse of power, indicating wanton and calculated disregard of the law by the city, and a predacious mechanical scheme to terrorize and forcibly evict suspected unlawful occupants under the guise of restoring public order. Makone, what do you make of this? So on one hand, I always think that it's a little bit gross when you have these like obvious media stunts, right? When you have a politician running out there and then, 3 buildings, big operation, lots of police things, but then that doesn't really reflect the sort of day-to-day maintenance of order. But what do you make of the complaints against the acting mayor, or briefly acting mayor, Makone?
I can't think of a better political stunt for the Patriotic Alliance to pull than this. And I think they've actually managed to co-opt a couple of EFF followers off of this. And because Julius Malema immediately came out berating him, condemning him and his criminal background. But I think this will have a lot of appeal with people on the ground who are faced with this issue, people in Hillbrow, people in Sunnyside, whose buildings have been hijacked. And I do recall that Makone Maja did a similar thing. And in his case, he cited that there was human trafficking activities going on in these buildings and questioned the so-called human rights organizations, which again purport to be for human rights, but oppose the emptying of buildings where human trafficking allegedly takes place. So I think this may have actually been a good look for the Patriotic Alliance. I do worry about the legality of the issue. I worry whenever I see the guys in the red suits go and approach any buildings to forcibly evict people. That certainly does worry me.
Yeah, it's kind of we've been forced now into this really difficult position by the bad socioeconomic condition of the country, and the general sort of lawlessness, which is that on one hand, when you see a court providing protections to legally occupied buildings, they're in effect often basically endorsing a slum, which is not really great for the people living there, and it's not really great for the people living around it. But at the same time, you can't just run around violating people's court-ordered, court-protected rights. It's kind of a difficult place, I think, for the city to be in, and I think it speaks to the larger dysfunction we suffer as in our cities across the country. Michael, what do you make of this?
I think that point about the larger dysfunction is the key one. I happened to notice a phrase in the Sunday Times' very critical editorial on Makone's activity, where they refer to the fact that politicians who wanting to get this kind of attention know that all they need to do is master the art of make-believe. So you pretend that you are actually tackling something decisively, and you knocking things down, or you're pushing people around, and you're really making victims of people instead of finding a real solution. But it is, as Makone says, very, very appealing to many voters.
Right. And it's not a systemic fix.
Yeah, it's a gesture, and quite a brutish one ultimately. Yeah.
Makone, final thoughts on this before we move on or close for the show today?
This comes with poor enforcement on the part of the police as well, because they themselves have not acted on these kidnappings or hijackings of these buildings. And so people are taking the law into their own hands, including the number one citizen of the municipality, the metro.
The temporarily number one citizen.
Oh, yes. Forgive me. The
Right,
weekend special mayor.
I think that's a very big point here, actually, is that when it comes to policing, if you actually start at the smaller level of dealing with like the smaller issues of urban decay, you can often contain the problem before it gets completely out of control. And if they had, if there was really good policing, we probably wouldn't have to worry so much about hijacked buildings and the damage they can cause to the lawful residents around them. But anyway, thank you very much for watching. That's all the time we have for on the show today. I hope you have a good weekend, and we'll be back next week on the Daily Print Show. Cheers, everyone.